Hello, my name is Kelly Goward. I am the Environmental Program Manager at the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council. I am sorry that we could not be in person together today, but I do want to thank the River City Wild Ones for inviting me to provide this presentation to you. So thank you all for attending. Here's a quick agenda of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I do in the Macatawa Watershed, and then we'll get into the bulk of the material. We're going to start with some basic review and some terminology. I am used to doing this presentation in person, and I do have some interactive activities that I like to do, so I would ask that you humor me and play along. And then we'll spend the majority of the time talking about different types of green infrastructure. So a little bit about the work that I do in the Macatawa Watershed. The Macatawa Watershed project is housed at the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council, and it has been since 1996. That's when we started, kind of in response to water quality impairments. The state had been monitoring the lake since about the 1970s, and the monitoring had determined there was too much phosphorus in sediment that was causing impairments to aquatic habitat. So at that point, the state was looking for a local partner to work with them to do some further monitoring and develop a plan for how to address the water quality impairments. And so in 1999, we developed the first watershed management plan. It was updated in 2012. And the bulk of the work that we do focuses around public awareness and education at all levels, from kids to adults. And then the second thing that we focus on is the on-the-ground restoration, putting those best management practices on the ground that are going to reduce the phosphorus and sediment inputs into the lake. We focused a lot in agricultural areas, improving on-farm best management practices that are going to reduce the sediment erosion, keep that phosphorus on the field where the farmers want it to be anyway. And then in 2013, a private initiative called Project Clarity was launched to help accelerate the restoration work that we were doing. Part of this was about a $12 million fundraising initiative. And so that's what really helped to accelerate the restoration, was having that funding available. I won't read you all the numbers. You can see a lot of work has been done just in those years since Project Clarity was launched. The big thing that everybody wants to know is, well, how are we doing? So the graphic that you see on the right shows kind of historical monitoring of phosphorus in the lake. You see that blue line there where Project Clarity started. And certainly we're still in the red, too much phosphorus, but we are starting to see a positive trend. We're going in the right direction. That phosphorus is decreasing. We still have a ways to go, but it is great to see that we're making progress. All right, so now begins our review time. So again, I usually do this interactive, in person. So we're going to go through these steps one at a time. Hopefully this is a review for most of you. If you've got an elementary student around, they may be able to help you play along. So we're going to start over on the left side with the process from oceans, lakes, and streams. So this is the process where liquid water turns into a gas. So that is called evaporation. The same process that occurs in plants, where plants release water vapor from their leaves, is called transpiration. A lot of times we lump these together and call it evapotranspiration, so you may have heard that term before. So once water vapor is in the air and it turns back into a liquid, into clouds, that process is called condensation. And then of course, once clouds get too full, they can't hold that water anymore. It comes back to the ground as precipitation, which could be frozen or liquid. Now once precipitation hits the ground, it has a couple different pathways it can take. So if it moves across the surface, we call that runoff. And then the other pathway that it can take is it moves into the ground through a process called infiltration. Once it's in the ground, water moves through the soil in a process called percolation, but we're not concerned about that process here. All right, so another fun little interactive thing I like to do in person to kind of warm you up for the next slide, where we're going to talk more about the water cycle, is a simple little spot the differences. So hopefully you've been looking at this already as I'm talking, and you're starting to see the differences in the two pictures. There are 5 of them, so hopefully you have found them by now. And there they are. So now I want you to apply the same principle to these photographs, a forest and an urban landscape. What are the differences in the water cycle? So think back to a couple slides ago where we went through those water cycle processes. How do those processes behave differently in these two situations? And we're really looking at 3 particular processes: the runoff, infiltration, and collectively evapotranspiration. So here's how they are different. So in a natural setting, we will have a lot of transpiration because we have a lot of plants. There's going to be a lot of infiltration because those plants are going to help with that, and very little runoff because we have space available for water to move into the soil as opposed to running off. So those 3 processes are going to be completely reversed in an urban built environment. We're going to have lots of runoff because of all of our hard surfaces will not allow water to infiltrate. We will have very little, if any, infiltration. And then because we've removed most of our vegetation, we're going to have much less transpiration, but yet we do still have some because we retain some of that vegetation. So here's another water cycle diagram that reinforces those differences between the natural water cycle and the urban water cycle. So again, we can see in the natural water cycle, we've got lots of infiltration, not as much runoff. In the urban water cycle, that's reversed, less infiltration and a lot more runoff. This diagram also, in the urban water cycle, completely removed transpiration. The other things that the urban water cycle diagram shows is some of the consequences of these reversals. So because we have less infiltration, there's less water that is recharging the ground. So we have less groundwater flow that's constantly feeding our streams. And so in that urban water system, our streams tend to dry up in the summer, the dry periods, because there's not enough groundwater flow to feed those streams. And then because we have a lot more runoff, when it does rain, our streams tend to flood. So we go from periods of dry to periods of high stream flow very quickly. And in an urban setting, sometimes we refer to this as flashiness. So you may have heard that term, and that's what this means. So a few more terms to review. The first one is watershed. I mentioned I work in the Macatawa watershed. So simply put, a watershed is an area of land that all drains to a single point. So the key thing here with watersheds is we're talking about the land, not necessarily the water. In the diagram, you can see watershed boundaries are defined by high points or ridge lines on the land. So wherever you are on the land, you are in some kind of watershed. The next term is stormwater. So what do you think of when you hear the word stormwater? This relates directly back to the water cycle. So at its simplest, stormwater is that runoff portion of the water cycle. It flows over the land, impervious surfaces. It doesn't soak into the ground. So really, stormwater equals runoff. Another concept that's important to understand is pollution. Now there's 2 main types of pollution, point source and non-point source. I wonder if anyone knows the difference between those. This diagram explains it pretty well. So point sources are pollution that comes from a defined definite point, typically from a pipe that comes from a factory or a wastewater treatment plant. You can easily find it, measure it, know where it's coming from, know what it's composed of. Because it's easily identifiable, comes from a pipe, it can also be regulated, which it is. Non-point source pollution, on the other hand, is coming from everywhere on the landscape. This is important in our watersheds and stormwater because non-point source pollution is picked up by stormwater as it runs off the surface. And that's why this is really important to understand our watersheds, because we are trying to manage the land to protect the water. We need to understand how stormwater is flowing and the pollution that it's picking up. All right, just a few more terms to go through. Low impact development is something you may have heard of in relation to green infrastructure. So what this is really a design approach that mimics natural processes. So it's a much more holistic look at how you design and plan a site. It's much more than just the practices that you put on the ground. So then green infrastructure is kind of that host of practices that you would put on the ground that would manage stormwater using natural processes that are going to help with infiltration, reducing runoff, and increasing transpiration. However, in West Michigan, we have historically referred to green infrastructure to mean the natural environment, our green spaces, parks, forest land, those green corridors. So that can get a little bit confusing because it's two very different things. So in order to distinguish between the two, I like to insert the word stormwater into the picture and talk about green stormwater infrastructure so that we're clear that we're talking about those practices that are managing stormwater as opposed to just our natural green environment. So here are the types of green infrastructure that we are going to spend the rest of the time talking about. We can put them into two different categories: non-structural, so things that we aren't necessarily going to design and build. So we'll talk a little bit more about native plant establishment and tree planting, and then the structural practices, which are the ones that are going to be more designed, in some cases require engineering, that you're actually going to have to build on the landscape. So starting off first with native revegetation or lawn reduction. So again, this is a non-structural practice. It's very simple, entry level, anybody can do it. The parts of the water cycle that this will impact are runoff. We will reduce runoff by having native vegetation, will increase infiltration, and increase transpiration because we're putting plants back in the landscape. So in the pictures here, you'll see one landscape that basically is just turf grass. So when we're comparing a landscape like that to native revegetation, it does make a difference in those water cycle processes. And I'll show on the next slide kind of an illustration of why that is. But you do tend to still see runoff from turf grass, not as much infiltration and not as much transpiration compared to native plants. Some additional benefits of using native plants is that you can increase your water conservation. Native plants are adapted to our natural conditions, so they don't need to be watered as much. And because they're adapted, they also don't need to be fertilized or have pesticide treatments. So that in and of itself will decrease the non-point source pollution, but they can also help absorb some of that pollution that might be running off of hard surfaces, driveways, rooftops, and kind of capture it, filter it before runoff water makes it into the storm drain system. Another benefit is that we're adding some wildlife value into our urban landscapes. Again, referring to that lawn picture, there is pretty much zero value to wildlife there, but by adding the native plants, we can provide some habitat for our urban companions, bees and butterflies, birds, those sorts of things. So this diagram illustrates why native plants are so good at infiltration. This little plant over here represents our turf grass, so very shallow root system. compared to native plants that have really deep root systems. So it's really these root systems that help water infiltrate into the soil. They form channels in the soil that really help that water go down deep. So in a turf grass situation, these roots are not going to help water get down very deep. So as soon as that portion of the soil saturates, then runoff can start to be generated from a turf grass system. So the next non-structural practice is tree planting. So this is similar to native revegetation, just a different type of plants. We're going to get similar water cycle benefits in reducing runoff, increasing infiltration, and then where trees really shine is increasing transpiration. Large mature trees especially use a lot of water. There's an example there for an oak tree can use up to 40,000 gallons per year. Additional benefits include water conservation, just like native plants. In addition, the shade that trees provide will help keep the soil temperature cooler, which will result in less evaporation and reduced need for water in the rest of your landscape. Trees provide air pollution benefits by pulling some of those pollutants out of the air. Trees can help increase our building energy efficiency by providing shade in the summer and blocking cold winter winds in the winter time. And then we'll certainly get that increased urban wildlife benefit as well. Trees can also be a very entry-level do-it-yourself sort of a practice. Both with native plants and trees, however, there certainly are professionals that you can contact to help you design, pick your plants, or even do the installation if you're not comfortable doing it yourself. All right, so our first kind of structural practice that we'll look at is bioretention or rain gardens. So bioretention is a kind of a catch-all category that at its simplest just means using plants, using other biology to retain water. So it can be done in different formats. Rain gardens are typically the most common and the most easiest to use in an urban landscape. So rain gardens, bioretention is going to use native plants, so we're really going to get increased infiltration here. We're not reducing the runoff, we are directing runoff into these gardens so that it can be allowed to infiltrate. And then since we're adding the plants, of course, we'll get increased transpiration. So now these systems, they do have to be designed, but they can be done very simply, or depending on your site constraints, may require some more complex engineering. But at its basic level, a rain garden needs to have an inlet, a way for water to get into it. So typically on a house, that might be your gutter downspout. It needs to have a ponding area, so where that water can pond and then be allowed to soak into the ground. And then there needs to be some kind of an outlet or an overflow in case that garden fills up. You don't want it backing up into your downspout or into your basement. So there needs to be some kind of a safe outlet or overflow for water to get out. So again, these can be very simple. They still require a calculation. And at the end, I will reference some resources that I'll provide to all the attendees and that has some materials that will help you do these calculations. So the next practice we'll look at are planter boxes. So this is a little bit more advanced than a rain garden, but something that you could still do at home. So these are designed to help increase infiltration, and because we're using plants, will also increase transpiration. So planter boxes can be used at downspouts of buildings to collect that water. The plants will use it in that box, but it's really getting that water into the ground. And then another place that planter boxes can be used are on streets, in street right-of-ways, in particular for kind of tree planter boxes, where water can be collected off of the street and into the planter box, where the tree can utilize the water. But again, really where the point of this is to get that water into the ground, infiltrating into the ground. So these can be somewhat simple. or highly engineered. Similar to rain gardens, major components, there needs to be a way for water to get in and a way for water to get out. But then the other key factor here is the soil media, whatever is going to filter the water through. Especially coming off of a city street, you may need to have a filter media that will remove pollutants that come off the street. So these do require some planning and design, and can be, like I said, a higher level, moderate to advanced. This is something that you'd probably need some assistance with, just again, depending on your comfort level. So the next practice is a green roof. I put this in the advanced category. This is certainly not a do-it-yourself project, and it's really best done at the beginning of a building project. It's difficult to retrofit a roof into a green roof, but with a green roof, it's a little bit different than the other practices because we are using this to reduce runoff. Typically, a roof is going to be completely impervious and all that water is going to run right off of it. But a green roof is going to capture that runoff and direct that water elsewhere, store it. The plants will transpire it. Green roofs typically aren't going to infiltrate water back into the ground. That water will stay on the roof. Sometimes there can be a drain pipe that would bring water back to the ground surface and into the ground, but typically not. A green roof does have some additional benefits. Will reduce the building energy cost. These green roofs provide insulation on the roof of a building, so reducing heat loss in the wintertime and air conditioning loss in the summertime. They also tend to last longer on average than a traditional roof system. So in the long term, over the lifespan of the roof, it's going to actually cost less and last longer than a traditional roof system. It certainly is something that must be engineered. There's a lot that goes into a green roof and it needs to be designed properly. And there are some different types of green roof systems, extensive and intensive. So you can see in the diagram there the difference. An extensive green roof is going to have a much less depth to the soil media. It weighs a lot less. It can be used in more situations. And then all the way up to an intensive green roof where it has a larger depth of soil. You can use more plants. It's going to be a lot heavier, more maintenance, a higher cost. The photograph underneath that diagram, if you're not familiar, this is a newer green roof system at the Frederick Meyer Gardens. It's an absolutely beautiful space, and it's kind of a mixture of both types. You can see some trees in there. The next practice is pervious pavement. So as opposed to standard pavement, this pavement is designed so that there are pore spaces that allow water to move through it instead of run off. So it's a special mix of either concrete, asphalt, so when it sets up, it has that pore space. And you can see in the one photograph here where water has infiltrated and it's running off the surface of the non-pervious pavement. It can also be in pavers. There's different types of paver systems. Some like the photograph here that would allow you to still put vegetation in between. Some that just have gravel in the cracks that allow the water to go through. There are certainly maintenance concerns with pervious pavement because they are porous and allow water to go through. They can become clogged and then not function. So things like salt and any dirt and debris coming from the road, from adjacent trees, from cars, could clog up the pores. So there does need to be some regular maintenance to keep those pores open and flowing. There's also concerns about physical damage from snowplow blades. So in a parking lot situation, snowplows would need to take extra precautions, either raise the blade or put on a rubber tip so they don't damage that surface. These definitely are systems that need to be engineered and are very advanced. Typically, you're going to see them more in parking lots, sometimes in sidewalks, but it certainly is possible to have one put in a driveway. So I believe this is the last practice that we're going to talk about, cisterns or rain barrels. Essentially, they mean the same thing. Cisterns tend to be larger systems like this one at the downtown market, where a rain barrel is more of a kind of a do-it-yourself at home. But these are designed to reduce runoff. So just like a green roof, they're going to collect water off of the roof of a building and store it for later use. The water is not necessarily meant to infiltrate, although if you're using it for irrigation in your landscape, then it will eventually infiltrate, but really the design here is to reduce and capture runoff. If you are using a rain barrel, you're going to also increase your water conservation, because that's in most cases what rain barrel water is going to be used for irrigating your landscape. These systems, especially the larger cisterns, can be built either above ground or below ground, depending on the space that's available. And these can be very simple barrels that you can build yourself, or they can be more complex and engineered. So basic components, similar again to the rain garden, you need to have a way to collect water, an inlet so water can get inside your barrel. There should be some sort of an inlet protection to keep mosquitoes out, so a screen at least. You can't really see it in any of these photographs, but there should be some kind of an overflow so that if a barrel fills up, it doesn't completely bust out the top and defeat the purpose of having the barrel in the first place. And then that overflow, it would be kind of toward the top of the barrel and would allow you to connect barrels together, which is what's been done in these photographs here. You need to have some kind of an outlet. How are you going to get water out of it? Somewhere near the bottom. And then these systems are typically going to be gravity fed, so you need to have a way to elevate them. A larger cistern like this is going to have a pump to actually pump the water out of it. So that's why I can just say this is entry level all the way to advanced, just depending on what type of system you need or want to have. I did want to say one thing about collection systems and gutters. So this photograph on the bottom here is my office, and you can kind of see we have a couple rain barrels here. We do not have gutters on the building. Gutters are probably the best way to capture water and direct it into a rain barrel. But if you can see, we do have these valleys in our roof system. So those are great for concentrating water, and they go right into those barrels. So it really just depends on your situation, what's going to work best. So that is the kind of the end of the presentation. I did want to mention some resources that are available for more information. If you want to learn more about green infrastructure, both just generally and more about design, the EPA has a really great website with just a ton of information. Specific to rain gardens, I've provided a link here, and we'll provide a PDF of the slides that'll have a live link. We put together a Google folder with just a ton of rain garden resources. So if you're interested in those, we are happy to share that. In particular, I want to highlight this Iowa Rain Garden Manual. There is a pretty simple worksheet, I forget how many pages into the manual, that helps you calculate the size of a rain garden that you need based on how much water might be coming off of your roof. So if you're interested in that, I'd highly recommend you take a look at that Iowa Rain Garden Manual. And then I do want to take a minute to highlight the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds Grand River Rainscaping Program. This is a fairly new program that's available through ELGRO, which is managed by the Grand Valley Metro Council. So they have a program where you can, as a homeowner, you can request that someone come out and do a site assessment at your property to look at your home for rainscaping practices. And so rainscaping is essentially these green infrastructure practices, kind of the simpler practices that you can do at home. So they would walk your site with you, look at areas that might be appropriate for a rain garden, for native plants, for tree planting, and kind of talk through any concerns that you might have on your property. And then they'll make you or give you some recommendations, a summary of what you talked about, and some recommendations, including recommendations for contractors that you might need to contact if you want to have someone help design and install a rain garden. They also have educational workshops that they hold occasionally, so you can just learn more about their rainscaping practices. And then if you are really into this and would like to be a volunteer to do the site assessments for homeowners, you can sign up to be trained as a volunteer. Again, there's a lot of information about this program on their website, as well as some other resources. And so with that, that is the end of my program. My contact information is there. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions about this presentation. And again, I want to say thank you to River City Wild Ones for inviting me to be a part of this program today. Thank you.